Hey friends, tonight's story begins with a letter. Not a love letter, but something a little colder. A little ink, a quiet seal, and a name written like a whisper someone hoped history wouldn't remember. So, before we start, dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always nice to know who's lying in bed with royalty and ghosts. Tonight, we're in France. Not the France of baguettes and Beirut, but the France of black gowns, poisoned rings, and queens who smiled softly while arranging funerals. Catherine de' Medici didn't wear a crown the way most queens did. She wore it like armor. And underneath, there was a heart that had loved once. Maybe there was a man, not a king, not a saint, just someone who had made her feel less surrounded. But power is expensive. And when you love something while holding a throne in your hand, you learn how to let go with elegance. She let go. This is the story of the queen who sent her lover to die and never spoke his name again. They say the halls of the French court whispered more than they spoke. The year was 1570-something, give or take a velvet hemline. The floors were polished so clean you could see your doubts reflected in them. Tapestries hung heavy with scenes of saints and sinners, though no one remembered which were which. The firelight curled in the corners like secrets, and every step in the palace echoed as if the walls themselves were trying to remember who had just walked through. Somewhere in that quilt of gold and marble, Catherine de' Medici sat at her writing desk, not quite alone, but not quite surrounded either. She had learned long ago that a queen was never truly with company just. Varying degrees of betrayal, dressed in different coats. She was a widow now. Technically, though the grief had come and gone like a badly written guest, her late husband, King Henry II, had left more behind than titles. He had left her with sons too young, courtiers too clever, and France unruly, boiling. Always 5 minutes away from a war or a wedding. And in the middle of it all, there had once been a man. History doesn't remember his name with much certainty. Some say he was a poet, others a soldier. Maybe he was both. It's a kind of man who stood just slightly too close during court dances, whose hand lingered when passing her a note, whose silence said more than his words. He had a crooked smile, the kind you notice twice once when it starts and again when you realize it's already gone. He wasn't royalty, but he understood her crown. Not as an ornament, but as a burden. That, more than anything, made him dangerous. Because a woman like Catherine could survive politics, plots, even poisoned pears, but understanding. That was lethal. The court called him a favorite. Quietly, with arched brows and half-finished sentences. But he never wore it like a trophy. He remained slightly out of reach, like the breeze that lifts your veil but doesn't take it. And Catherine, ever the tactician, pretended not to notice how often her eyes drifted toward the gardens when he trained in the yard. Still, France doesn't tolerate softness for long. The country was teetering. Catholics and Huguenots were locked in a dance where no one knew the steps. Assassins visited more often than ambassadors, and the people. They were hungry for bread, for safety, for someone to blame. That's when the murmurs started. The man she trusted had attended a meeting. Not just any meeting. The kind that happened at night when maps were unrolled and names whispered like spells. Catherine heard of it in the way queens always do, not directly, but through a series of looks and silences so carefully arranged they felt accidental. His name was mentioned, and suddenly, everything she had not questioned became suspicious. How long had he been watching her? How many letters had he read? Did he know the names of her son's tutors? Or which guard on the West Gate was loyal only in theory? She wanted to ask. But queens don't ask. They write. That night, the ink in her pen paused only once, when she wrote his name. It trembled, just slightly. Not enough for the parchment to flinch, but enough for the candle beside her to gutter in the draft. She sealed it with wax, dark red, like dried regret. No flourish, no signature. Just a mark that meant, act swiftly. The letter passed hands before morning, and by dusk, so had he. Arrested, questioned, found conveniently guilty of conspiring with enemies of the crown. The charges were vague. The punishment was not. He was to be executed at dawn quietly, cleanly, and far enough from Paris that no one would be tempted to turn it into poetry. Catherine did not attend, but she awoke just before sunrise. Not with guilt, exactly. With the sensation of something being rearranged inside her chest. Like a chair moved slightly out of place, the kind of discomfort that doesn't hurt but never leaves. They say she wore black that day. Not for mourning. That was simply her habit by then. A queen in permanent shadow. When asked about the man, she said nothing. Not denial, not defense. Just the kind of silence that grows roots. And that is how history remembers her. The queen who played sons against swords, who smiled through massacre, who arranged marriages like chess pieces. But somewhere, in a quiet corridor, no one sweeps anymore. There is still the ghost of a crooked smile and the echo of a name that was written once, then never spoken again. Power has a way of echoing in empty rooms. And in the weeks after the execution, Catherine de' Medici heard it everywhere. Not the man's voice. That had vanished the moment the blade fell. But the shape of him's absence hung like a tapestry she couldn't quite bring herself to remove. The court moved on, as courts do. There were feasts to attend, treaties to sign, daughters to marry off to men who smiled too often and said too little. France was boiling beneath her feet, and no one seemed to notice the steam curling up the columns. But Catherine, she noticed. She always noticed. Every time she passed the west corridor, where he once leaned against the stone archway waiting for no one in particular, she felt something tug behind her ribs. Nothing dramatic, just a flicker. Like catching your own reflection and realizing it blinked a little too late. She buried it, like she buried everything, under layers of velvet and protocol. She arranged meetings with generals, signed decrees in gold ink, and made the decision to cancel a spring mask. Not because it reminded her of him, but because joy had started to sound like betrayal. Meanwhile, the nobles stirred. France was not a quiet country. Every town seemed to have a priest and a rebel, and sometimes they were the same man. The Huguenots, the French Protestants, were growing bolder. And Catherine, Catholic by allegiance, but survivalist by nature, found herself walking a rope that had frayed in the middle. Her son, the boy king Charles IX, was technically in charge. But everyone knew who held the quill, who drew the maps in silence while others slept. Catherine's reign was not built on kindness, but on calculation. And yet, sometimes, late at night, calculation thinned. She would sit by the window with a candle, not reading, not writing, just listening to the wind, to the creak of floorboards, to something she couldn't quite name. Memories arrived out of order. The way he used to glance sideways when amused. The sound he made when clearing his throat before disagreeing with her. The time he reached to brush dust off her sleeve and then paused, realizing too late how intimate it was. She had let it happen. She hadn't looked away. And now that pause played on a loop in her mind, always unfinished. She never spoke of him again. But silence can be loud. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed that certain books disappeared from her chambers. That a particular flower-pale blue, the color of his family's crest, was no longer welcome in court arrangements. One maid, too bold or too foolish, mentioned his name while brushing Catherine's hair. The queen had her reassigned to the kitchens by morning, not punished, just removed, like the man had been. Efficient regret, France demanded it. And still, the court buzzed with rumors. They said Catherine was planning something, a purge, a massacre. They weren't wrong. The St. Bartholomew's, Day massacre was stirring beneath her skin like a fever, unspoken but inevitable. Protestant nobles were flocking to Paris under the guise of celebration her daughter's wedding to Henry of Navarre. A Huguenot, a brilliant trap, or a terrifying gamble. But Catherine didn't flinch. She had already given up the one man who made her feel anything. Giving up a few thousand more barely made her pulse skip. Or so she told herself, because sometimes, just before sleep, she would see a crowd in her dreams. And in the middle of it, his face, not accusing, not angry, just there, watching, unmoving, like a painting that had not been removed, just turned to face the wall. There's something peculiar about power when it's quiet. It doesn't shout anymore. It lingers. Catherine's grip on the French court had never been louder, but inside, things had grown eerily still. Not the kind of stillness that comes with peace, but the kind that follows a scream or an execution. The kind that makes chandeliers sway when no one's moving. She continued to govern with the same sharp grace. Her son Charles drifted further into fragility, a boy dressed as a monarch, jumping at shadows and bleeding from the nose at inopportune times. The court physicians blamed humors. Catherine blamed ghosts. Not literal ones. She didn't believe in hauntings, but she did believe in memory. And memory was crueler than any spirit, especially when it chose to haunt you in the faces of strangers. She began noticing him again, not in the flesh, of course, but in fragments, a gesture from a young guard. The tilt of a noble's head during a bow. A musician who lingered one note too long on a chord he used to hum under his breath. It was unbearable, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Because the pain had calcified into something she wore beneath her ribcage, like a second set. Of bones, it didn't ache, it just shaped her. She had grown used to him being gone. That was the worst part. His death had become functional, a thing that had to happen. It cost, she had counted. She told herself this often, in the bath. The altar, in meetings where generals discussed troop movements, and all she could think about was whether he would have worn gloves on a day like this. She never cried, not because she was strong, but because tears were loud. And Catherine preferred her. Grief to be obedient, contained, archival. She once had his portrait removed from the guest wing. It wasn't labeled, but she knew which one it was. A scene of falconry, forgettable at a glance. But there he was, third rider from the left, just slightly ahead of the others, as if he always knew where he was going. She didn't burn it, she simply had it moved. To the cellar, behind wine barrels no one reached for anymore, as if burying a canvas could bury a memory. Meanwhile, preparations for the wedding continued. The union of her Catholic daughter and the Protestant Henry of Navarre was supposed to bring peace. But in every sweetened toast, there was a sour aftertaste. Paris was swelling. Nobles had arrived from every corner of France. And behind every handshake, someone counted knives. Catherine moved through it all like a ghost, still pretending to be queen. She arranged seating charts like battle maps, calculated glances like currency. And at night, when the halls emptied and the torches crackled down to embers, she sometimes found herself walking toward the old tower steps. She never climbed them, just stood at their base, listening, as if the stone might return her name in. His voice, it never did. The night before the massacre, rain threatened the horizon. The sky was gray enough to feel like morning. Catherine didn't sleep. She sat in her chamber with a chessboard she never finished. The Queen's Square was empty. She stared at it for hours. When the bell rang just before dawn, she stood. Not as a woman, as a crown. The blood that would follow was already hers. She had claimed it, measured it, approved the ink on the orders. But somewhere deep in the folds of her, beneath the velvet, beneath the powdered face and practiced poise, there was still a whisper that had not gone quiet. His name? It had begun to sound less like a memory and more like a question. Not why did he betray me, but did he? She would never know. That's what made it permanent, the not knowing. Regret isn't loud. It doesn't knock. It waits. It builds furniture. It stays. And in Catherine's palace, it had long since moved in. They called her the Black Queen, not just for the mourning gowns that trailed behind her like spilled ink, but for the decisions she made without blinking. France had become a machine of elegance and fear, and Catherine was its silent engine. But even the best machines hum when they overheat. In the days following the massacre, Paris did not smell like bread and rain the way it used to. It smelled like iron, like boots that had not dried, like firewood that refused to catch. The city was quieter, not in the peaceful way, but in the way a room gets quiet after a scream. The bells rang for the dead, but no one wept publicly. Mourning had become political. Grief was a strategy. And Catherine wore hers like a medal. She stood beside her son as though nothing had happened, even as he twitched and muttered about ghosts in the rafters. He was unraveling, and she was something else entirely, not stone. Something older, something polished. The kind of strength that doesn't sparkle but sinks, deep down where the pressure reshapes you into something no one recognizes anymore. Behind closed doors, the nobles celebrated. The Protestant threat had been handled. Toasts were raised, glasses clinked, and Catherine sat still. At the edge of the celebration, her fingers pressed lightly to the stem of a goblet she never drank from. She watched faces that had always been her gift. She could read a lie off someone's cheekbone, betrayal in the way they blinked. But even now, surrounded by allies, she didn't feel safe. Because safety, she had learned, was an illusion you fed yourself when the floor stopped moving. And her floor hadn't stopped in years. Every shadow still reminded her of him, not because he had been heroic, not because he had died well, but because he had looked at her once and not flinched. Most people did. Even now, years later, the only time she remembered what kindness felt like was when she thought of his hand brushing hers sedenally. On a staircase that no longer existed, they had torn that wing of the palace down, said it was crumbling. But Catherine knew better. It was a ghost removal, one brick at a time, and yet he remained. In mirrors, in half-dreams, in the way her body still leaned slightly left when walking down corridors, as if expecting to find him there. Her ladies avoided that side of her. They had learned in their own quiet way that the queen's stillness was not calm. It was depth, and no one wanted to fall in. She wrote less, spoke less. And when she did speak, it was measured, soft, and final. Move the envoy to the North Chamber. Cancel the hunting trip. No red roses. The last request came. Abruptly one morning, when a visiting noble sent a bocalash, blooming and stained with dew. Catherine stared at them for a full minute before whispering her objection. The servant who received the command later said he had never seen her blink. That her eyes were open like someone waiting for a sound that never came. She had heard it, of course. The echo. The laugh. That laugh. That laugh. Always too honest for a courtier, too warm for a soldier. She had buried that sound somewhere in her chest, and sometimes, when the halls were very quiet, it tried to find its way back out. She never let it. Queens didn't echo. They issued commands. But her silence had begun to gather its own power. The court whispered that she had changed, that she spoke to herself in the garden, that she once ordered a window bricked up because the light reminded her of someone. They didn't say his name. They didn't have to. Regret isn't just something you carry. Sometimes it becomes your furniture, your architecture, your government. And Catherine for all her crowns and victories, had begun to live inside a palace built out of silence and a single name she would never say again. Time in a palace does not pass like it does in the rest of the world. It drips slow, like wax down the side of an untouched candle. It folds in on itself, wrapping memories around corners until they start to feel like furniture. And Catherine lived among those folds now. She moved like someone who had already lived too many lives inside one. Her steps deliberate, her gaze always half a second behind, as if she was listening for a sound no one else could hear. The year had turned over quietly. The calendar changed, but nothing else did. Her son, Charles, grew thinner, stranger. He stopped eating certain foods, refused to wear velvet, claimed he saw men in armor walking through his chambers at night. The court physicians bled him with leeches and hope, but Catherine saw the truth. It wasn't madness, it was memory. The kind that festered. The kind that called out in voices that sounded like the ones you loved, dried up until they vanished. She did not tell him what she heard in the corridors. She did not share that sometimes when walking past the east stair. She caught the faint scent of cloves and rain and turned too quickly, expecting someone who could not possibly be there. Instead, she played her role. The Black Queen, the mother, the shadow. She arranged treaties, tightened her circle, and began building plans for a new alliance that would see her youngest son installed in Poland. Another chess move, another distraction. But distraction is not the same as peace. And even queens, practiced as they are in the art of self-denial, cannot outmaneuver silence forever. One night, she woke from a dream, not in fear, but in stillness. The kind of waking where you're not sure if you've returned from somewhere or if you've just arrived. She sat up, slowly. The moonlight fell in through the slits of the tall window, striping her bed in pale silver. There, on the far wall, hung a tapestry she hadn't looked at in years. A hunting scene, hounds, horses, falcons, figures in motion. And there, again always he was, the third rider. The one with his face turned slightly away. It wasn't detailed enough to be him, not exactly, but she knew. Her memory filled in the lines. Her grief did the rest. She stared at it for hours, not moving, not even blinking. And as the morning bells began to chime across the city, she rose and did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She opened the window. Just a crack. Enough to feel the chill of dawn. Enough to hear the bells without them being filtered through glass. Enough to remind herself that the world was still turning even if she wasn't. That day, she didn't speak. Not one word. Not to her ladies, not to her son, not to the scribes or the cardinals or the spies who watched her with quiet reverence. And in that silence, something shifted, not visibly, not externally, but somewhere deep within her, a door that had been sealed began to creak, not open, just loosen. Regret doesn't always roar. Sometimes it seeps, curls under doors, between, cracks in moments when you think you've finally forgotten. And then it reminds you with a scent, a shadow, a name you don't say. Catherine didn't weep. She wouldn't allow it. But her hands trembled slightly when she removed her rings that night. And the ring she left on the one he had given her long ago, in some forgotten gesture of friendship. Maybe love wasn't one anyone noticed, but she noticed. And for a queen like Catherine, who had learned to bury everything she felt beneath robes and ink and lineage, noticing was the closest she ever came to mourning. A queen's legacy is not written in ink. It's written in whispers, in the pauses between sentences, in the corridors no one uses anymore. Catherine knew this. She had built a reign out of those pauses, a government of glances and half-truths. Her name would live forever. They satched in stained glass, embroidered in velvet, sewn into history. But Catherine wasn't interested in forever. She was interested in control. and control, she had learned, was most powerful when it looked like calm. Her son Charles was unraveling. He wept openly now, sometimes in public. He screamed in Latin. When startled, he accused portraits of blinking. And Catherine remained steady. She issued commands in a voice as soft as winter dust. Her hands no longer trembled, not because the sorrow had passed, but because it had settled. Regret doesn't always fade. Sometimes it just folds itself into your spine and teaches you to stand differently. And Catherine had become a monument to standing, to enduring. But monuments are cold for a reason. In the palace gardens, she now walked alone. No longer offered to accompany her, not out of respect, out of unease. She had become too quiet and too precise. The younger ladies called her the shadow that wears a crown. They never said it to her face, of course, but she didn't need to hear it. She could feel it in the way they avoided eye contact when she passed, in the way they clutched their shawls tighter, even when it wasn't cold. Catherine preferred it that way. Solitude had become her only honest companion, and in that solitude, memory began to bloom. Not in sudden visions or theatrical hauntings, but in subtler ways. She'd find herself pausing in doorways she hadn't noticed in years. She'd stop mid-sentence when a servant coughed a certain way. She once halted a meeting with foreign dignitaries because the scent of one man's cologne reminded her of late autumn, and late autumn always reminded her of him. She told no one. She recorded nothing. Her journals, once detailed and meticulous, now had blank pages scattered throughout, like breaths she had chosen not to take. The court scribes whispered that the queen was losing her edge, that she was slipping. But Catherine was not slipping. She was softening against her will. Her power still held. Her word still ruled. But inside, the woman who had once ordered a man's death with no more emotion than brushing a crumb from her sleeve had begun to wonder if grief could ferment, if it could grow darker over time, stronger. She began visiting the chapel more often, not to pray, just to sit. In silence, sometimes she would stare at the stained glass until her eyes blurred, and in the colors she saw the folds of a man's cloak, a hand resting casually on a sword. A smile that was never for the public, and she would close her eyes before the face could form, because she already knew what it would look like. One morning, while reviewing letters in the garden, a page stumbled, tripped over his own boots, and knocked a tray of ink to the ground. Catherine did not scold him. She didn't speak at all. She only watched as the ink seeped into the gravel path, curling, branching, blooming like something alive. For a moment, she thought of blood. Then she thought of ink. Then she thought of the parchment, that one parchment, the letter she had sent, the name she had written. She wondered where it was now, burned, buried, folded into some archive no one would ever read. She wondered if it still carried her fingerprint. Someone, centuries from now, might touch it and feel a chill, the way she now felt when she thought of him. But the thought passed, like they always did. She blinked, rose, and ordered the app. Ink cleaned up without another word. Queens didn't dwell. They endured. And yet, she found herself walking the garden path differently that day. Slower, as if each step required permission from some version of herself, the one who used to walk beside a man she would later erase. It is a strange thing to outlive your usefulness and still be needed. Catherine de' Medici had become that paradox. Her sons were kings in name, but not in presence. Her enemies were fewer, but more cunning. And her allies, well, they were only as loyal as the ink on her most recent letter. Still, they came to her for decisions, for guidance, for permission. Even the ones who feared her most, especially them. They sat in her chambers with dry smiles and louder flattery, waiting for her to nod. And she would, slowly, precisely, as if her silence had to be weighed before every syllable. But inside, Catherine no longer burned with ambition. She simply continued, each day like a room she walked through without turning on the lights. She now poured her energy into her youngest son, Henry, not because she believed in him, but because she needed something to focus on, something to fix. The boy was clever, charming, and utterly unaware of the sharpness of the world he was about to inherit. Catherine watched him like one watches a candle in the wind, protective, anxious, and already preparing for darkness. She began arranging a path for him to the polished throne, a distant crown, a temporary distraction. It kept her busy, occupied, but not comforted. Nothing comforted her anymore. Not the warmth of fireplaces, not the polished steps of the palace, not even the touch of soft fabric against her wrist, which once used to calm her in anxious moments. That calm had become unreachable. And in its place, she began to feel something else. The weight of echoes, not guilt. Guilt is loud and immediate. This was something softer, older, like the feeling you get when entering a room and forgetting why you came, only to realize it reminds you of someone who is no longer alive. That was the kind of memory Catherine carried now. One afternoon, she passed a servant in the east corridor. Oh, a young man tall, dark-haired, with a posture too relaxed. For court, he reminded her of someone. Too much. For a moment, her steps slowed. She looked up, expecting no, needing to find something in the boy's face. A sign, a glitch in time, a mercy. But he looked past her, bowed too quickly, and kept walking. And just like that, the spell broke. The ghost faded. She did not turn around. But she walked slower for the rest of the day, as though recovering from a bruise no one else could see. That night, she dined alone, not by order, by habit. Even her most trusted attendants had begun to sense that her presence, once magnetic, now pulled like gravity. Heavy, relentless. She ate sparingly, not from lack of appetite, but because every bite tasted like paper. She began noticing other things, subtle shifts. A draft in her bedchamber she could never trace. A faint tapping behind the walls on windless nights. The way her own reflection sometimes looked slightly delayed. Nothing supernatural, just the mind rearranging grief into puzzles. Because it cannot live without trying to solve something. She no longer visited the chapel. Instead, she sat at the window, always the same one, the one that faced the orchard. The one where, years ago, she had seen him riding in the early morning fog before the others awoke. He had looked up, once, just for a moment. Their eyes met through distance and mist, and nothing had been said, but everything was understood. That moment had no name, but it had stayed with her longer than any vow, longer than any crown. She often thought of that now, especially when the fog rolled in from the hills and blurred the gardens into memory. Some nights, she imagined that if she simply opened the window wide enough and leaned out far enough, she might see that figure again. Not a ghost, not a fantasy, just a possibility. But she never opened it more than a crack. Queens did not reach. They received, and so she sat, day after day, year after year, becoming something more ancient than royal, a keeper of unspoken stories, a monument to one forgotten name, one sealed letter, one decision that echoed in silence louder than any decree. That was her true legacy now. Not the sons she placed on thrones, nor the treaties she carved in gold, but the quiet, the stillness, the choice that would never leave her, no matter how many empires she outlived. It is said that in her final years, Catherine de' Medici stopped aging. Not in the way poets write about beauty, not in skin or stature, but in presence. She became timeless, not eternal, just paused, like a painting whose colors no longer changed with the seasons. She walked the palace with the same quiet precision, the same unreadable mouth, the same hands folded just so, but something had shifted behind her eyes, as if time itself had lost its grip on her. Those around her did their best to keep pretending. The guards bowed lower. The scribes wrote faster. The nobles flattered more poetically, fearful that the end of the queen would mean the end of balance. But Catherine noticed. She always noticed. They no longer feared her. They pitied her. And nothing stung quite like pity. Her letters grew shorter, her dinners quieter, her steps slower. And though she never missed a council meeting, never forgot a name, never stumbled on protocol, she began forgetting smaller things, not details, but textures. She couldn't recall the smell of the river in spring, or the exact sound of his laugh, just the way it used to make her stop thinking. She forgot whether his hair had curled near the temples or stayed smooth. She wasn't sure if he had ever held her hand in public. She remembered everything about him, and yet nothing completely. It was maddening, like trying to hold smoke. In your hands, and in that slow erosion of memory, she began to wonder whether forgetting was mercy or punishment. The palace had changed around her. Walls had been repainted, corridors renamed, tapestries replaced. The portrait of the hunting scene had been taken down without her asking. No one mentioned it, but she noticed. And in the blank space where it had hung, she now imagined him more vividly than ever. Not as he was, but as she remembered wanting him to be. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest trick of all. That grief could revise, repaint, and reshape someone until even their absence became a lie. She began walking less. Her ankles ached in the mornings. The stairs grew longer. Her eyes, once sharp enough to catch the lie behind a smile, now blurred when reading in candlelight. And yet, she never let go of routine. She woke at the same hour, dressed with the same care, chose her accessories with the same intentional elegance, even if no one noticed, even if no one cared. Because ritual was the only thing still tethering her to the world. And somewhere in that ritual, she still made room for him. A whisper of perfume, a gesture she once saw him make, a glance toward the orchard that no longer bloomed. In her mind, he remained young, not because he had died young, but because she had stopped remembering him in age. It had become a feeling, a shape, a memory with no shadow. And perhaps that's why she could never fully let go, because there was nothing to bury, nothing to argue with, nothing to forgive, just a silence that followed her like a second cloak. On the rare occasion that someone mentioned the past, a visiting diplomat recalling her husband, or an old noble making a cautious joke about her early days, Catherine would smile. Not warmly, but distantly, as if those memories belonged to someone else, a different queen, a different century. But when they mentioned love in any form, any story, any rumor, her expression never changed. It remained unreadable, composed, but her fingers would twitch ever so slightly, as if remembering how it felt to hold something she should have kept, or to write a name she should have never written. She had stopped wearing rings altogether. Now, not because of pain or swelling, but because her hands no longer needed adornment. They had written enough, commanded enough, let go of enough. And in their quiet bareness, they finally looked like her, honest, empty, waiting. By the time the leaves began to fall again, no one asked her opinion about the color of the banners. No one requested her signature on wedding announcements. Even the youngest maids, who once tiptoed in fear of her gaze, now walked a little faster, a little lighter, as if the air had thinned around her. Catherine noticed. Of course she noticed. Her power hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. She was no longer the flame. She was the smoke, present, inescapable, but easy to forget once it drifted out of sight. she began spending most. Mornings in a small side room off the main hall. One with a single window and a heavy chair that creaked only when she leaned back too far. The walls were bare. The fire was rarely lit. It was the quietest place in the palace. That was why she liked it. That, and because no one ever followed her there. She would bring a letter to read, not to respond to. Just to hold. Other days, she brought nothing, just herself and the air. And the memory of a voice she couldn't describe anymore. It was in that room that she began to forget what he looked like entirely. She still remembered the way he made her feel. A strange clarity, like cold water in warm light. But the details had faded. The exact tilt of his mouth. The lines near his eyes. Whether he walked with a slight limp or a perfect stride, gone. And that terrified her in ways she couldn't name. Not because it was sad, but because it meant she was losing her last witness. That part of her, the woman who once felt everything, too deeply. Who once imagined that love and power could sit in the same room without devouring each other. That woman was disappearing. Every day, a little more. Her body betrayed her more frequently now. A tremor in the hand. A gasp after 3 steps too quick. The physicians said it was age. She knew better. It was the weight of what she never said, of what she never let herself feel out loud. Regret is not a visitor. It is a squatter. And by now, it had furnished every room of her heart. She still received visitors, of course, foreign envoys. Family, the occasional bishop looking for favor. They came in, bowed too deeply, spoke too quickly, and left with whatever answer they thought they wanted. But none of them looked her in the eye. Not really. And certainly not long enough to notice that hers had changed, not in color, but in direction. She wasn't looking at them anymore. She was looking through them, past them, behind them, into rooms that no longer existed, into faces that only she could still remember, and only just barely. There was one morning, a gray one, soft with fog, when she awoke before sunrise. No one had knocked, no bells had rung. She simply opened her eyes, and for a moment, she thought she wasn't alone. She felt it not as a presence, but as an absence that had returned, as if the space beside her had remembered who used to stand there. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just lay still, her breath slow, her eyes wide, as the faintest light touched the ceiling in shapes that looked familiar. Then it passed, like all things do. And when her ladies arrived to dress her, they found her already standing, already silent, already dressed in black, as though the day had begun without her, and she was only now catching up. They said nothing. They never did. She ate only a few bites of bread that day. Read no letters. Asked no questions. But she sat at her writing table for over an hour, pen in hand, parchment blank, not hesitating, not lost, just remembering. The way someone might stare into a forest and wait for a name to come out, but it never did. That afternoon she returned to the small room by the hall, closed the door behind her, sat in the same chair, looked out the same window. And as the light faded and the corners of the room blurred into dream, she whispered a single word. It might have been his name. Or it might have just been air moving through old lips. But no one heard. No one wrote it down. And even she wasn't sure when it was over. If she had said anything at all, by the winter of 1588, Catherine had become a rumor inside her own palace. She was still there, of course, still breathing, still ruling in the subtle ways that don't appear in records, but her presence had softened. It no longer startled rooms into silence. It settled into them like dust. Visitors spoke of her in hushed tones, as if too much volume might snap the spell that kept her upright. She no longer attended court dinners. She no longer reviewed the day's correspondence in the grand hall. Instead, her days had shrunk to a series of small rituals: a slow walk to the window, a pause by the mirror she no longer looked into, a teacup held a little too long after it had cooled. Time no longer moved in days or months, it moved in distances. The distance between her hand and the table. The time it took to remember a name and the silence that followed when she couldn't. And still, she did not complain. Queens do not. Mourn out loud, they erode quietly. Her physicians, ever diplomatic, began speaking to her in circles. They asked about her sleep, about her appetite, but no one asked her what she missed. No one asked her what she remembered most clearly. Perhaps they feared the answer, or perhaps they feared there wouldn't be one. The truth is, Catherine had begun to live almost entirely in the past, not deliberately, but involuntarily. Her present had thinned. She sometimes mistook the names of her grandchildren. She confused the seasons. One morning, she ordered snow to be cleared from the steps, though none had fallen. But her memory of it was so vivid, so certain, that no one dared contradict her. A handful of attendants rushed out with brooms, sweeping frostless stone with the seriousness of mourners. And inside, Catherine sat by the fire, staring at nothing, or maybe at something only she could still see. That day, she spoke of him, not by name, not even directly. Just a single phrase, dropped between two sips of warm broth. He never got to see snow that year. The maid nearby froze, unsure whether to respond or retreat. Catherine said nothing else, just stirred the spoon 3 more times before setting it down. She wasn't speaking to anyone, not really. She was speaking to the memory itself, testing whether it still answered. That's how it was now. Less conversation, more haunting. Her mind wandered through doors that hadn't opened in decades. She once asked whether the West stables still kept bay horses. There hadn't been stables in the West Wing for 20 years. Another time, she ordered a bottle of ink she had once, used as a young queen, one that no longer existed. The apothecary brought her a replica. She smiled, said nothing, and never used it. The past wasn't a place she wanted to revisit. It was the only place she still recognized. And yet, even inside that past, she was losing details. She could recall entire days, but not the weather. Whole letters, but not the ink. His touch, but not the temperature of it. That was the cruelest part. That the sharpest memories didn't vanish in chunks, they frayed, one thread at a time. She still held a certain posture in public, still offered small nods, quiet commands. The raised eyebrow that once caused grown men to change their alliances. But beneath all of it, she was becoming untethered. A leaf still attached to the branch, but only by habit. She didn't fear death, not really. She had outlived most of her enemies, most of her family, most of her illusions. But she feared what would be left behind, not for France, but for herself. She feared the one unfinished story, the one name no record carried, the one mistake no historian would ever understand because they never knew the shape of her silence. She feared that when she left, he would vanish too, that no one would remember he existed, not even as a footnote, because she had made sure. Of that, she had buried him in the quiet, in the unsaid, in the dark corners of decisions dressed up as necessity. And now she was the only one who knew where to look. But her memory had begun to turn away. The last months of Catherine's life came not with ceremony, but with softness. There was no grand procession of final visitors, no flood of whispered apologies or urgent last confessions. Only stillness. Only the sound of footsteps that didn't. Echo of doors that creaked just slightly less, of candles that burned down without being replaced. The palace had begun to mourn her before she was gone. Not openly, but in the way people spoke just outside her chambers, slower. quieter, with eyes half-averted, as if not to disturb a sleeping cathedral. Catherine noticed, even now, especially now, she had always been a watcher. And in these fading days, she saw everything. The younger courtiers no longer asked for her blessing. The painters stopped bringing sketches for approval. The tailors quietly stopped offering fabric samples. The world had already begun to close its doors around her, gently and politely, as if guiding her out of a room without saying so. But Catherine had never needed announcements to recognize a goodbye. Her body, once resilient and sharp, now betrayed her in slow increments. She rose from bed as if climbing out of history itself, deliberate, aching, uncertain whether the floor would meet her feet. Her hands, those once commanding instruments of ink and strategy, trembled even when still. She no longer walked the halls. The halls came to her. Messages delivered, decisions deferred, signatures replaced with nods. Even her reflection had begun to disappear. The mirror above the writing desk no longer held her gaze. She glanced toward it out of habit, but saw nothing worth remembering. The woman who once wore a crown-like armor now sat wrapped in wool, staring out a narrow window as if waiting for a ghost to return something she'd forgotten. And in a way, she was. She never said his name again. Not once. But in the space between her words, he lingered. In the way she requested the window to be opened, even in the cold. In the way she asked the servant to leave the chair across from her empty. In the way she sometimes looked toward the door a moment before anyone knocked, as though someone else might enter. Someone she had banished long ago, yet never truly dismissed. Regret, in these final days, became less of a weight and more of a weather. It drifted in and out of her with her breathing. It didn't ache anymore. It hummed. A low, constant presence that reminded her she had once felt something, too dangerous to name. There were days she hardly spoke at all. The servants learned to interpret her silences, one for tea, another for pain, another for solitude. But one silence remained unreadable, the one that settled over her when the light turned gold across the floorboards. That hour between day and night when memory walked more freely. She often watched that light without blinking, as if hoping it might carry a message, as if it might finally speak for her, since she never had. A priest was sent for, though she had not requested one. He entered softly, respectfully, offering last rites in a voice too formal to mean anything. She allowed it. Not because she believed it would save her, but because it felt like closure, a ritual box to check before exiting the stage. She listened, eyes closed, fingers still. And when he finished, she simply said, "Thank you." Nothing more, nothing less. No tearful monologue, no apology to the heavens, just that. Because the one person she needed to apologize to had long since stopped listening. One morning, she did not rise. The window was open, as always, and the breeze carried in the scent of damp stone and something faintly floral, jasmine, perhaps, though none grew nearby. The maid found her sitting upright in bed, hands folded neatly, eyes closed, but not asleep. Peaceful, they would say serene. But the truth lived in the small things. The chair still pulled slightly away from the wall, as if someone had just stood. The ink bottle closed, but not put away. A folded scrap of paper, blank on both sides, resting beneath her hand. And on her nightstand, a ring simple, unadorned, unfamiliar to most, but not to her. To her, it had always meant something too. Fragile for gold. Catherine de' Medici died not as a villain, nor as a queen to be mourned with flags and parades. She died as a woman who had chosen power over feeling, and remembered the cost every day after. Her name would remain in history. Her deeds would be debated in candlelit halls, but her regret that lived in silence. And in silence, it stayed. After Catherine died, the palace did not weep. It exhaled. not in relief, but in ritual. The curtains were drawn. The bells were rung. The physicians whispered of final hours and failing organs. The scribes prepared the proclamations. But beneath the velvet and parchment, something quieter unfolded. A kind of forgetting, not immediate, but certain. Her name remained, of course, engraved into histories, stamped into treaties. Muttered by those who still remembered how power once moved with a woman's hands. But her presence faded. The long corridors she once walked now echoed differently, as if they had grown used to her weight and didn't quite know how to hold the silence she left behind. Her sons gathered, some in mourning, others in posture. Their grief, like their politics, was measured. One wept. One stared blankly. Another spoke of legacy as though it were an inheritance, not a wound. None mentioned the quiet chair by her window. None asked about the ring. None noticed the ink. Bottle that had not been opened in weeks. These were not things they understood. These were the remnants of a queen who had ruled with more than strategy. She had ruled with memory. And memory, it turns out, is difficult to inherit. The servants were the first to notice the strange stillness, the way certain rooms felt colder. Now, the way a breeze moved through the west garden as if retracing a forgotten path. One maid swore she saw a flicker of movement in the tower stairwell just once, just a shadow. But she said nothing. She simply crossed herself and lit a candle in the chapel, even though it was midday. The priests called it devotion, but she knew better. Some stories are never fully told. Some names never fully die. And Catherine's silence had always carried a name that no one else knew. In the days following her burial, the court shifted. New alliances were drawn. New whispers replaced old ones. The tapestries changed. The rooms were repainted. A portrait was moved into storage, not out of malice, just practicality. Dust settled in the corners where she used to pause. The world continued, as it always does, even when it shouldn't. But in the quiet folds of memory, her regret lingered. Not written, not spoken, just present. Like a breath caught between sighs. The man she had once loved, or nearly loved, or only almost trusted, faded faster than she did. His name, already missing from records, was now absent even in rumor. There were no statues, no tributes. Only the faint impression of a figure who had stood beside power and vanished beneath it. It was what she had intended. And yet, it was the one outcome she had never truly accepted. There's a kind of grief that only arrives after death. Not for the body, but for the story left unfinished. For the letter never sent. For the truth too dangerous to survive history, Catherine's was that kind of grief. It lingered in the pages the scribe skipped, in the margins where notes were erased, in the way no one ever dared ask who the hunting rider in the tapestry truly was. Because by then, no one remembered, or no one wanted to. And still, on certain days, when the wind passed through the garden in a particular way, when the light caught the glass just right, when a door creaked at the wrong moment, the older servants would pause. Just for a second, just long enough to wonder. And sometimes, without knowing why, they would. Look toward the tower stairs, as if someone might still be waiting. Catherine's legacy did not die with her. It changed clothes. It wore the robes of the chroniclers, the smiles of politicians, the voices of men who had never sat in her chambers but now told her story as if they had lived it. They wrote of the Medici blood, the widowhood, the 3 sons she placed on the throne like a chess master advancing her pieces. They described her as shrewd, cunning, dangerous. Some called her ruthless, others a savior of monarchy. A few whispered the word, which, though only when the candles burned low and the windows were shut tight. But nowhere in any scroll, sermon, or speech did they write about the man, the one she ordered to his death, the one who had stood at the edge of power and looked at her not with fear, but with understanding. His name had been erased, too completely, too carefully, not just by her, by the machine she had built, the system of silence, the architecture of forgetting. It was efficient, it was thorough, it was permanent, or so they thought. For years, portraits of Catherine continued to hang in noble halls, always the same expression, poised, unreadable, distant. Artists painted her with lions, with scrolls, with shadows. Never with softness, never with sorrow. They captured the queen, but not the woman, and certainly not the woman who once paused at staircases, wondering if she'd see a familiar smile around the corner. Her reputation hardened over time. The woman who once wrote letters in ink now lived in stone marble busts, Latin inscriptions, marble tombs that bore her titles but not her truths. Children memorized her name in lessons about kings and bloodlines. Scholars debated her politics, but none of them asked why she never remarried, why her diaries from certain years were left half empty, why she built entire gardens with winding paths that led nowhere. In the quiet spaces of history, the gaps, the pauses, the unsaid, the real Catherine remained, not as a villain, not as a saint, but as a shadowed presence behind every decision, every silence, every piece of history that felt just slightly incomplete. And still, in odd corners of France, strange stories persisted. A rider seen at dusk near the old royal orchards. A woman in black glimpsed through misted windows long after her burial. A name never spoken, found scratched into stone behind a chapel door, worn down by time but never fully erased. Some said it was imagination, some superstition. But there are those who understand that some legacies do not live in books. They live in the air, in the rooms that go cold without reason, in the feeling that someone is still watching, not out of vengeance, but out of memory. Because some regrets are too large for history to carry. They belong to the silence. And in that silence, Catherine still waits. Not to be forgiven, but to be remembered, just to be known, truly, fully once, even if only in the quiet before sleep, when all the stories fall away. And only the truth remains soft, flickering, and impossible to write down. There comes a time in every life when memory becomes myth, not all at once, not with a single lie or story, but slowly, like a portrait left in the sun, fading into something softer, something easier to love or to hate. Catherine's story did not disappear. It transformed. It was cleaned, rearranged, embroidered with details that never happened, and stripped of the ones that mattered most. Artists painted her in impossible scenes, seated beside kings who had already died, clutching scrolls that never existed. Her eyes were always painted too dark, too wide, too knowing. Children in noble houses whispered that she had cursed her enemies, that her gardens grew nothing but poisonous herbs, that her rings contained secret blades, that she slept with books under her pillow to keep her visions at bay. None of it was true. And yet, in some quiet way, it all felt real, because no one remembered what truly happened. Only what it felt like to be near her legacy, and that feeling. The chill, the silence, the weight of unspoken things remained more vivid than facts. In one castle, a worn painting was discovered decades after her death. It showed a woman in black, seated near a window, her hands folded around a piece of parchment. The face was obscured by time, smudged, faded, almost unfinished, but her posture was unmistakable. Beneath the paint, a faint inscription had been scratched into the frame. The Quiet Queen. No date, no artist, no explanation. In the records, could anyone find proof she had ever sat for such a portrait? But there she was, or perhaps only the memory of her. In some villages, the old women told stories at dusk of a queen who had outlived love itself, who walked gardens at night with a candle in her hand, looking for a letter she had once burned, but could no longer find. They said she whispered a name to the wind, and that the wind always replied with silence. Young girls listened wide-eyed, wondering if that name had ever been spoken out loud. The mothers never said, because they, too, had been told not to ask. Memory, after all, is not always preserved in books. Sometimes it's passed through glances, through the way someone lingers at a window without knowing why, or the way a hand hovers over an empty chair before pulling it out. And in those moments, Catherine returned. Not as a ruler, not as a warning, but as a question, a presence, a soft pause in the story. There were scholars who tried to reclaim her, who searched for the missing letters, who traced her handwriting across treaties and compared the ink to older, more private notes. One claimed to have found a coded message in a ledger dated 2 years before the man's death, a pattern of phrases that, when strung together, formed a sentence that made no political sense but every emotional one. I kept him safe until it was no longer safe to keep him. But the scholar was discredited. Too emotional, they said, too speculative. And so the discovery was dismissed as coincidence. The ledger returned to storage. The sentence forgotten by all but one, a librarian who, years later, still remembered it by heart, though she never told a soul, because some truths are too fragile for history to carry, and Catherine's truth, the one she never wrote, never spoke, never allowed to live in daylight, had become something else entirely, a myth, a shadow, a whisper in stone. But in that whisper was more truth than any official chronicle could hold, because beneath all the politics, beneath the marriages and wars and alliances, Catherine had once chosen power. And with it, she had lost everything she could not name. That is what the stories remember, even if the names are wrong, even if the dates blur, even if the man she loved is now only a feeling in the air. They remember the loss, the ache, the queen who walked too far into silence and never found her way out by the time 100 winters had passed. Catherine's name no longer stirred fear. It stirred curiosity. She was no longer the queen who outlived kings, nor the mother of failing monarchs. She was a story, a soft one spoken over candlelight when the hour grew too late for politics, and the air turned thick with questions no one asked aloud. In the drawing rooms of aging noble houses, her tale was told like a sigh, not as history, but as a haunting. She kept a ring that didn't match her others. Some said, it wasn't gold, it wasn't jeweled, it wasn't royal. No one remembered where the story started, but it traveled. From castle to cottage, from diary to legend, the details changed. In one version, the ring had been made from iron, so plain that it could only have meant something sacred. In another, it was carved from dark wood, with initials etched inside, worn down by years of touch. Sometimes the man's name changed too. In one tale, he was a soldier who saved her life. In another, a poet who recited her soul back to her. Through locked doors, and in the softest retelling, the one shared between mothers and daughters. When hearts were tender and sleep was near, he was neither of those. He was just a man who loved her, truly, quietly once. They say she never let him die in her mind. That even when she signed the paper, she paused before the ink dried. That she looked out the window that day, not because she doubted her decision, but because she wanted to remember the light, because she knew he would never see it again. These were the kinds of stories that did not belong in textbooks, but in lullabies. In the spaces between breath, in the way someone pauses before. Writing a name they aren't supposed to remember. And it was in this dreamy space that Catherine lived on. Not in stone, not in titles, but in the way people told stories about her without quite knowing why. in the way a girl might stare at a portrait too long, wondering what the queen was thinking, in the way an old man might walk past a garden hedge and pause, as though someone had once waited there for him. There were even those who claimed she appeared in dreams, always seated, always near a window, always holding something she never opened, letter, a lock of hair, a memory. The dreamers never asked what it was. They just woke up feeling as though they'd overheard something they weren't meant to know. A few even said that in the dream. She looked at them, really looked as though recognizing something. A thought, a sorrow, a secret that didn't belong to them, yet lived inside them just the same. That was the strange power of regret. It echoed. It didn't stay buried with the body. It slipped through cracks in time, whispered through generations, waiting to be felt again, not to punish, but to be understood. And Catherine's regret was of that kind. Gentle, lingering, patient. It asked nothing. It just remained. In stories passed down not for their accuracy, but for their ache. And the ache was always the same. The one thing she couldn't undo. The one face she never repainted. The one silence she never filled. They say that if you sit alone in a quiet room just before sleep and think of the last person you loved, but never truly kept, you might feel it. The faint trace of her, not beside you, not behind you, but somewhere in the room. Watching, not judging, not mourning, just remembering. Because Catherine never needed to be forgiven. She only needed not to be forgotten. Long after her name faded from court debates and political sermons, Catherine de' Medici remained exactly where history could not reach her in the minds of women who ruled quietly. Not all of them said her name aloud. Not all of them even knew the full story, but they felt her. In the weight of their rings, in the choices they made with eyes fixed on doors that never quite opened, in the way they folded letters they would never send. Queens in far-off kingdoms kept portraits of her tucked behind larger ones, not for reverence, but for recognition. They saw something in her expression they could not name, but deeply understood, not power, not pride, but the gaze of someone who had carried too many secrets and left one behind on purpose. Catherine became a kind of mirror, a ghost story that wasn't about fear, but about restraint, about what it cost, too. Keep the throne and lose the one thing that made it feel warm. Young princesses, just learning the language of diplomacy, were told her story as warning. Never mix softness with strategy, they were told. See what became of her? But older queens told it differently. Behind closed doors, in firelit chambers where advisors did not tread, they whispered of Catherine not with judgment, but with a kind of gentle sorrow. She knew one said once, folding her shawl tighter. She knew that love doesn't die when it's lost. It dies when it is erased. And that was the version that stayed. The quiet Catherine. The one who chose silence because it was the only way to keep his name safe from history's cruelty. There were rumors, of course, as always. A queen in Denmark once confessed to dreaming of Catherine 3 nights in a row, always the same. Setting a garden at dusk, a candle flickering in the wind, a single empty chair facing west. Another, in a colder kingdom, claimed she found a ring inside her desk drawer, plain. Old, unfamiliar, after a difficult decision had been made. She wore it for a week, said nothing, then returned it to the drawer and locked it again. These were not facts. They weren't meant to be. They were ripples, soft ones, the kind that appear on the surface of a lake when something too heavy has sunk beneath it. Catherine was never canonized, never glorified, but she became something older than sainthood. She became a symbol, not of what should be done, but of what is carried when a woman rules the world and loses her own. In the quiet moments between war and wedding, between childbirth and coronation, some queens would pause, look out the window, touch a ring, or fold a letter and tuck it away, without sealing it. And in those moments, she was there, not in form, not in name, just in feeling, just in silence. The same silence she had once worn like a veil, not to hide from the world, but to protect the part of her that the world could never be allowed to touch, across time in cities that no longer spoke the French of her court. Catherine's story continued, not as biography, but as a breath between confidences. Queens born centuries later found themselves staring into mirrors she never touched, feeling the same chill beneath their jeweled collars, the same quiet question beating just beneath the gold. What must I lose to keep what I hold? They did not need to know the details of her life. They felt its shape, in letters left unfinished, in rooms kept locked long after a lover's departure, in gardens walked alone at twilight with no guards in sight. They spoke of her when the world was asleep, not often, and never clearly. But she returned in those moments as a shadow that understood. One queen, far to the east, kept a portrait of Catherine facing her bed. Visitors assumed it was for admiration. They were wrong. She kept it there as a reminder, that even power bowed to grief. That silence could outlive crowns. Another, ruling in a colder land, once wrote in her private journal, "There was a woman who once had everything but warmth. I do not remember her name, but I see her eyes in mine when the candles go out." These echoes were not deliberate. They were instinctual. They came from the same place where tears are swallowed before meetings, and where heartbreak is wrapped in silk so it doesn't show beneath state robes. Some queens wore rings not given by kings. Some kept letters in drawers beneath treaties. Some gave orders they regretted, then never spoke of them again. And in every one of those choices, Catherine's ghost passed softly through, not judging, not guiding, just witnessing. That was her strange immortality. She was not remembered for what she built, nor entirely for what she destroyed. She was remembered for the pause, for the silence, for the ache that has no place. In ceremony. In cathedrals where queens were crowned and later buried, her name was rarely spoken. But some said that when the wind moved through the rafters in a certain way, it hummed like parchment being turned slowly, thoughtfully, as if reading something long hidden. In libraries, her letters were studied for politics, but no scholar could explain the one page that held no words, just ink smudges and the faint outline of what might have been a tear. Some called it damage, some called it nothing. But one archivist, old and nearing retirement, once said gently, "No, that's the truth. That's the part she didn't know how to write." And still, the world spun. Crowns passed hands. Thrones changed shapes. Kingdoms rose and fell. But behind every throne sat a room. And in that room, often at dusk, often when the world outside was too loud, a queen would pause. Her hand would hover above paper. Her eyes would search for something not present. And her chest would tighten in that familiar, silent way. The ache of choosing power. The ache of letting go. The ache of not being allowed to grieve in public. Catherine had carried that ache alone. But in time, it became shared. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. Through rings, through glances, through breaths held too long, through names never spoken. And so she lived on, not in the records, but in the ritual. Not in the crown, but in the quiet space just beneath it, where queens still keep their hearts folded small, hidden behind duty, waiting to be remembered by someone who knows how to listen. In the quiet corner of a modern archive, buried beneath dust and dates and documents that no longer stirred much interest, her name appeared again, softly, as if asking permission. It began with a misplaced ledger. Nothing important. A routine. Misfiling. A scholar sorting through royal correspondences of the late 1500s. looking for economic records, came across a binding that didn't belong. Thin, frayed, labeled only with a single word, Prive. No seal, no title, no indication of its value. But something about its presence, its misplaced stillness, felt deliberate, like it hadn't been lost, like it had waited. Inside were pages that barely whispered, half-finished letters, fragments of messages, notes written in the margins of calendars. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, the curling descender of the Y, the stern precision of every name written in full. But what stood out most were the omissions. Names were blurred or absent. Phrases ended just before a confession. One page in particular caught the researcher's breath. A date written in the upper corner that coincided with an execution the court never publicly acknowledged. A note followed it. For words, I wrote the end. No signature, no explanation. Just that. The scholar, young, obsessive, prone to believing in patterns others dismissed, didn't know what they had found, only that it didn't fit into anything they'd been told. Catherine was supposed to be strategy, poison, power. A queen who moved men like chess pieces and kept France stitched together with ink and veils. But this was something else. This was personal, intimate, uneasy. The scholar didn't sleep that night. They read and reread the fragment, searching for what wasn't written. They began pulling every letter, every court memo, every execution. Order from that year. It's not for what they said, but for who they didn't mention. And slowly, a shadow began to take shape. A man without record. A decision without motive. A silence too heavy to be coincidence. Over weeks, the obsession grew. The scholars stopped filing the documents as instructed. They stopped talking about their research in official meetings. They stayed later in the library, ate less, slept in brief intervals filled with strange dreams, always the same. A woman seated in a high-backed chair, candle flickering beside her, her face just out. A view, and always, just before waking, she would lift her hand as if to write something, but never begin. One night, they opened a sealed envelope tucked between the pages of a larger volume. The seal had faded, its wax cracked and nearly crumbled. Inside was a single page, blank except for a faint circle, the mark of something that had once been folded inside it. A ring, perhaps, or a cup, or a lock of hair tied with thread. The emptiness of the page said more than words. It said, "This is what I couldn't keep." At that moment, the scholar felt a strange certainty, not of facts, but of feeling. They no longer needed proof of who he was or what he meant or how he died. They understood something deeper that Catherine had not simply erased him from. The record she had tried to save what little could survive, and the only place it could live was in the silence. The realization unsettled them. It was the kind of truth that doesn't get published, that doesn't earn tenure or applause. It simply remains, quietly, heavily, waiting to be recognized by someone soft enough to hear it. They closed the ledger, gently, held it in there, lapped for a moment longer than necessary, then placed it back where it had been found, not misfiled, but resting, as if it had only needed someone to read it once, to remember that even history has rooms that don't appear on the map, that not everything worth knowing is written in full. And as they left the library that night, they paused in the doorway, looked once more toward the shelves, and whispered, without knowing why, "I see you." After the scholar left the archive, something curious began to ripple not in the halls of academia. Not in formal journals or conference halls, but in the soft, strange places where memory lingers. They spoke of the discovery to no one, not because they feared mockery, but because they knew the story wasn't meant to be dissected. It was meant to be felt, so they carried it gently, folded it like a letter never sent, but the knowing changed. Them they began to notice things, details others passed over. In a painting gallery, they paused too long before a portrait of a woman whose gaze was too steady, too sad to be decorative. It wasn't even marked as Catherine, but something in. Her eyes made the scholar's throat tighten. On a train, they overheard two strangers speak in fragments about the queen who wrote love into silence, though neither of them knew which queen they meant. At home, a dream returned, one they hadn't had in years. A narrow window, a wind that never quite stopped, and the sound of footsteps retreating, but never arriving. They woke with tears they hadn't earned. Catherine, once banished to textbooks and scandalous footnotes, was quietly seeping back into the world, not as history, but as presence, as pulse. Not in headlines, but in art. A young poet, countenance away, published a slim collection of verse, titled The Queen Who Folded Her Heart. It made no explicit reference, no footnotes, just soft imagery. Ink-stained fingers, a candle left burning through dawn, a ring forgotten in a basin of water. Readers wept without knowing why. A sculptor in southern Italy cast a statue of a seated woman whose hand never quite met the page before her. It was titled, She Never Wrote the Last Line. Tourists passed it without fanfare, but some lingered quietly, placed their palms to the bronze, and whispered apologies they hadn't realized were waiting inside them. And somewhere a gallery. Wall in a city known more for commerce than history, an anonymous artist hung a minimalist canvas. Just a smear of fading red, a blank page, and a single phrase scrawled in the bottom corner. I chose silence. It sold within an hour. No one could explain why. It wasn't viral. It wasn't trending. It simply touched something ancient, something human, something that every person carries in the softest place, the loss that has no proper funeral. The grief that was never allowed to speak. Catherine's story wasn't returning as a headline. It was returning as a hush, as an echo, as a familiar ache behind the eyes during songs with no clear meaning. Even those who didn't know her name began to feel her, in the way they paused before deleting a message, in the way they touched the glass over an old photograph, in the way they looked at someone across a crowded room and said nothing, not because they didn't feel, but because they felt too much. She became, again, what she had always been, the queen of the unsaid. And now, in a world louder than ever, her quiet was louder still. A teacher wrote her name on a chalkboard one day during a lesson on forgotten monarchs. None of the students had heard of her, but one asked, "Did she ever write poetry?" The teacher paused, looked at the name, and said softly, "Maybe. But if she did." She didn't write it down, and that was all. That was enough. Because Catherine didn't need her legacy restored. She didn't need a monument. She only needed someone to notice the silence she left behind, to know that it meant something, that it still means something. It began with dust, a fine layer of it clinging to the edge of a wooden frame, forgotten in the back of a provincial museum that no one visited unless it rained. The painting had no label, no catalog number, no known artist. It had been there. For decades, maybe longer, waiting behind crates and broken display glass. When the restoration intern pulled it out, it didn't look like much. A woman seated in profile, the colors dulled to smoke, her face half turned, lost in shadow. One hand resting atop a small, unreadable object. Perhaps a letter, perhaps nothing at all. But it was the eyes. Even obscured by grime and time, the eyes still watched. Not pleading, not inviting, just present. Knowing, the intern almost set it aside, almost moved on. But something about the posture held them there. That's strange. Balance between composure and collapse, like a person mid-thought, mid-loss, mid-confession. They took it to the back room, began the slow work. Day by day, the image returned. a collar of soft velvet. Fingers gently curled, as though bracing for something. A candle stub on the table. And in the corner, once completely hidden beneath years of decay, a trace of script. Not painted boldly, not even meant to be seen. Just etched faintly into the wood beneath the varnish. Pour si qui foot, et ni foot John. For what was, and never was. The phrase sent a chill through the intern's spine. It's not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was restrained, deliberate, like someone had tried to name a sorrow without inviting attention. They took a photo, posted it online without caption. Within hours, messages came in. Historians asked about provenance. Poets asked for permission to borrow the phrase. One woman, aged 92, wrote a handwritten letter to the museum saying she had dreamed of that image when she was a child, a queen by the window, unable to turn around. No one could verify anything. No one had proof. But none of them needed it, because they all recognized the feeling, not as fact, but as echo. The museum hesitated at first. It was, after all, just a dusty old canvas. But interest continued to grow. Visitors came. Quiet ones, not in crowds, not with flash photography. Just individuals, a widow, a young woman unsure of her voice, a retired historian who hadn't published in years, each standing before the portrait for longer than they meant to. Some cried, some simply nodded. One left a ring beneath the frame. No note, just a simple band of worn silver. The intern, watching from a corner bench, realized something. This wasn't a display, it was a return, not a grand unveiling, not a royal correction, just a soft restoration of something once hidden. Catherine was not being claimed back by power. She was being welcomed back by those who had known silence, who had made choices and lived with them, who had carried regrets that had no place in dinner, conversations, or diaries. The painting, unnamed, still was given a temporary label, Unknown Queen, circa 16th century. But the visitors knew. They didn't need the plaque. They knew her the way some people know grief, not by face, but by the way it shifts the air in a room. And so, without announcement, without permission, Catherine returned to courts, not to textbooks, but to the quiet, where she had always belonged. Where truth lives, not in records, but in the space between brushstrokes. The portrait didn't speak. It didn't move, but it held. That was what people noticed first. That it held something, not an answer, not even a story, just a space. A space where people could place what they'd never had words for. Slowly, and without instruction, the area around the painting began to change. Not physically, no new signage, no velvet ropes, no museum announcements, just a feeling. The bench in front of the portrait became occupied more often. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Visitors brought books but didn't open them. Others stared in silence, eyes fixed on the hands in the painting. They often looked at the fingers, gentle, waiting, holding something light but heavy. A letter, perhaps. A memory, a goodbye. Then, almost without plan, objects began to appear. The ring was first, then a folded note. Then a pressed violet in a small, cracked frame. All discreet, all left quietly. The museum staff debated removing them. It wasn't proper, it wasn't protocol, but no one could bring themselves to do it. The offerings weren't graffiti, they weren't spectacle. They were small acts of release. Like people were saying to the woman in the frame, "Here, I couldn't carry this anymore, but I think you'll understand." A mother left a photograph of a daughter she hadn't seen in years. A poet left a page with no poem, only a title, The Queen of What Wasn't Said. A teenage girl left an envelope filled with torn letters, none addressed, none signed. There were no instructions, but a kind of unspoken agreement began to settle in. Those who visited the portrait didn't take pictures. They didn't talk loudly. they left space. Not just physical space, emotional space. Grief, regret, longing, all of it lived there now. And somehow, it didn't feel heavy. It felt held. Like the woman in the painting was still listening, still absorbing, still making room for sorrow that had nowhere else to go. Some began to call the space the Quiet Gallery. Not officially, not with signs, just in murmurs. It was the room people sent friends to after a loss. The place someone might wander into after a hospital visit or a long silence between text messages. A woman once came straight from a courthouse. She didn't look at the painting long, just stood in front of it and whispered, "I didn't want to sign it, but I did." Then she left behind a silver key and walked away. No one followed, no one asked, because no one needed to. That was the strange thing about Catherine's presence. It didn't demand understanding. It offered recognition, not the grand kind that says, "I see you in your glory," but the softer kind that says, "I see what you never said out loud, and I know how much it cost." The museum staff eventually placed a small wooden tray beneath the frame, not to encourage the gifts, but to keep them from being swept away by the cleaning crew. Over time, the tray filled with quiet things. A feather, a thimble, a cracked compass, a coin with no country, and no one ever took anything back. Because once something was given to her, it stayed. Not as tribute, but as trust. And slowly, stories began to attach themselves to the painting. A child asked, "Is she waiting for someone?" A man in his 90s said, "I think she loved someone, and then it ended, and she never talked about it." A young visitor, barely 10, stood before her and whispered, "She looks like she's listening to a song only she can hear." No one knew her name, but everyone felt her ache. And in that ache, they found their own reflected. Not to dwell in it, but to let it soften, to let it be. And so, Catherine remained, not frozen in time, but finally unfurling. Her silence no longer a sentence, but a sanctuary. It began slowly, a ripple, not a wave. Not all at once, not with headlines or curated exhibitions, but with conversations that weren't supposed to happen. With stories that had waited too long. One afternoon, a woman in her 70s sat in front of the painting and began to cry. Not the sharp, sudden sobs of grief, but the long, quiet kind that has waited behind the ribs for decades. Another woman, younger, sat down beside her. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just placed a hand gently on her shoulder. After a long silence, the older woman said, "I married someone I didn't love because I thought I had to." She said it like a confession, but it sounded more like a breath finally exhaled. And the younger woman, after a pause, whispered, "So did my mother." They never exchanged names. They never spoke again. But they left something behind in the air. A softness, a kind of shared knowing that hovered long after they'd gone. Catherine's portrait became that kind of place. Not a monument, not a shrine. A permission. A space where people could name the unnamed and the world would not collapse. A teacher left a note that read, "I told my students I chose this life. But the truth is, I was too scared to choose the other one." A man in his 50s stood before the painting and whispered, "I loved him, but I let him go because I thought it wasn't allowed." A young mother, after hours of walking her restless baby in circles, stood quietly and whispered nothing at all. Just let the silence settle around her like a blanket. She left behind a pacifier, wrapped in ribbon. None of these moments were planned, none were recorded, but the museum staff began keeping a notebook, not for data, not for records, but to preserve the tenderness. They wrote down phrases visitors said as they passed. "She looks like someone who waited too long to say it." Long after the painting had found its place on the gallery wall. Long after the notes beneath it grew too many to count. Catherine began to drift again, not as a figure of history, but as a feeling. She moved beyond the frame, beyond the marble floor and whispered benches, into the quiet spaces of people's lives, into rituals that had no names, into small human acts that no one talked about but everyone somehow understood. A young woman, sitting alone in her apartment after a goodbye she didn't choose, lit a single candle and placed a ring in a dish beside it. She didn't say anything, just watched the flame flicker against the metal, as if asking the silence to witness something she couldn't say aloud. A man in a city far away printed a copy of the painting Laura's Illusion, grainy and taped it inside his closet door. Every morning he looked at her before he got dressed, not for guidance, not for comfort, just for the reminder that someone, once, had also carried something too heavy to speak of. Poets began referencing the silent queen, not always by name, but always with knowing. In anthologies and chapbooks and quiet corners of the internet, phrases began appearing. She wrote nothing on the last page, and that's how we knew it mattered. I left him for the same reason she signed the letter. Not because I didn't love, but because I loved and still walked away. Some queens wore crowns. Others wore regrets tucked under their sleeves. None of these went viral. They didn't become trends, but they lived, whispered between pages, shared between friends, scribbled in margins of old journals. Catherine had become something sacred, not sanctified by church or state, but by the human heart. And then came the rituals, not public, not formal, but deeply real. On certain nights, often the first chill of autumn or the anniversary of something unspoken, people would light a candle by the window, not in mourning, not in hope, just in memory of the things they never said. Some placed a ring beside it, others a letter they never sent, others nothing at all, just the flame and the silence, and the feeling that they were not the only ones carrying the weight. A small cafe in a quiet neighborhood began leaving one table empty on rainy days. No menu, no chair, just a candle and a single line framed beside it, for what was and was never. No one explained it. And yet, regulars started leaving things. Folded napkins with drawings, old train tickets, broken watch parts, pieces of time paused, pieces of lives that were still mending. Some began calling it Catherine's table. There was no movement, no foundation, no official recognition. But in dozens of places, in bedrooms and attics and stairwells and kitchens where silence had settled, thick, Catherine returned. Not with speeches, not with history, but with stillness. And the most remarkable thing was this: no one wanted her to be fixed. No one demanded a happy ending. They didn't need to know the full truth about the man, or the reason, or the last moment. They just needed the ache, the softness, the shared understanding that sometimes love must be left behind. Not because it meant less, but because the world asked for more than the heart could hold. One woman wrote in a letter, "I don't need to know her name. I only need to know she existed, because that means I'm not the only one." And that, more than any portrait, any letter, any crown, was Catherine's legacy. Not in fact, not even in memory, but in resonance. In the way she became part of people's most private moments of letting go. In the way she gave shape to sorrow without needing to explain it. In the way she allowed others to sit beside their grief and know that it was not weakness, but proof of love. I think she forgave him, even though he never knew. She reminds me of the part of myself I never explained to anyone. Soon, others began doing the same. Notebooks appeared on nearby benches. Visitors began writing to the painting, not as if it were art, but as if it were a friend, a listener, an ancestor. A version of themselves they never became, but never stopped imagining. Letters piled up, some sealed, some wide open. Some were just drawings of rings, of candles, of windows half open. One note simply said, "I kept it secret because I thought no one would understand, but maybe she would have." These were not grand stories. They were not for documentaries or books. But they were real, deeply real, and that made them powerful. For all her titles, all her regal bearing, all the legends whispered around her name, Catherine had become something far greater in stillness than she ever was in rule. A home for those with nowhere else to put their ache. It was no longer about whether she loved him or what exactly happened or why she signed that paper. That mattered once, but now she belonged to everyone who had ever chosen silence over loss and then lived with the cost. Visitors began calling. The painting, the listener. Still unofficial, still without a label, but it caught on. Because that's what she looked like now. Not a queen demanding attention, but a woman who had heard too much and still made space for more. The staff didn't fight the change. They leaned into it. The frame was gently cleaned. The lighting softened. A small plaque was added, not with a name, but with a phrase taken from one of the letters left behind, for what was loved but never spoken. And beneath it, a simple dedication, in memory of all the stories we were too afraid to tell. It came one evening without warning, the way certain truths always do, soft, dreamlike, as though summoned from somewhere between sleep and memory. A woman sitting by a window, not old, but tired in the way that doesn't show on skin, closed. Her eyes for a moment. The city murmured outside. A kettle whistled and cooled. And in that half-light of not thinking, not planning, she saw herself, but not as she was, as someone else. As a figure seated at a writing desk hundreds of years ago, hands resting just above a page that would never be finished. She wore no crown, but she knew it was Catherine. Not the painted version, not the queen from the history books, but the woman beneath all that. The woman with the silent mouth and loud heart. In the dream, or the vision, or whatever space she had slipped into, there was no conversation, just a feeling. The feeling of recognition, of carrying something precious that had never found its name. The woman opened her eyes slowly, unsure if she dozed off or simply wandered somewhere important. Everything looked the same, yet nothing did. She rose, walked to her kitchen drawer, pulled out an old envelope she had tucked away years ago. It was addressed, but never mailed. Inside was a photo, a dried leaf, and a note she couldn't remember writing. I didn't stop loving you. I just stopped saying it out loud. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood quietly, as if bearing witness to her own stillness. And that was the turning point. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just the slow settling of something long. Unsettled. Catherine wasn't just a woman from another time. She was a mirror, showing each of us the unfinished parts of our lives we still carried like heirlooms. The woman placed the envelope on the windowsill, lit a small candle beside it, and whispered, "I understand now." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, or closure. It was something quieter, alignment. The recognition that some stories don't need endings. They need space. They need light. And they need a witness. And so, as the candle flickered against the glass and the city lights blinked far below, one more person joined the long, quiet line of women who had never met Catherine, and yet knew her like a secret they'd been holding all their lives. And so it happened. Not with proclamations or restorations, but in countless quiet lives where Catherine's shadow began to soften. Not as a specter, but as a presence. The kind that doesn't arrive, but is suddenly already there. In a small coastal town, a widow who had spent 17 years sleeping on only one side of her bed found herself one night turning slightly, laying her hand in the empty space beside her, and closing her eyes not in grief, but in gratitude. Not because she had forgotten him, but because, at last, she had forgiven herself. In a bookstore with creaky floors and dust-thick windows, a woman in her 30s curated a display titled Unfinished Letters, an anonymous collection of notes never sent. unsaid truths scrawled on napkins, receipts, scraps of forgotten stationery. Beneath it, she placed a single phrase handwritten in faded gold ink. She didn't need to be heard to be remembered. Visitors began leaving their own letters, folded pages left inside books, confessions scrawled in the margins of novels, names inked on the inside flaps of journals and quietly shelved away. No one curated them. No one archived them. But everyone who saw the display understood. They didn't ask who she was. They only whispered, "I know what that feels like." In another city, halfway across the world, a violinist who had once given up love for the sake of her career performed a new composition titled The Silent Queen. It had no words, just long, aching notes that rose and trembled and fell like breath held too long. The audience didn't applaud right away. They just sat there, stunned by the way the silence at the end was the loudest part of the piece. And far from the cities, in the hush of a mountain village wrapped in snow, an old woman kept a ritual passed from her grandmother's grandmother. One night each winter, she lit a fire, wrote a name on a slip of paper, and burned it in a copper bowl while whispering, "Be free." She never said whose name. She never needed to. These things, small, sacred, unspoken, became Catherine's church. Not built in stone, but woven into memory, into the rituals of release we create when the world offers no space for grief. Because Catherine had never been about the grand gesture. She had been about the choice, the impossible choice between Mossy's elm, between heart and crown, between self and survival, between love and the unbearable weight of power. And while history recorded only what she signed, what she ruled, what she orchestrated, the truth of her, the deepest, softest truth was found not in those moments of command, but in the long hours afterward, in the solitude of a queen, who had sent her lover to die and then carried the silence like a child who never had a name. That was the part no portrait could show. But people had begun to see it in themselves, in their mothers, in their daughters, in the quiet women they passed every day who bore entire novels inside them and never spoke a page aloud. Catherine had become the mother of every unfinished story, every unsent letter, every love that lived only in breath. And with that came a strange peace, not closure, not resolution, but something gentler. Permission. Permission to feel it, to hold it, to let it live without needing to explain. Because some stories are too tender for endings. Some sorrows don't ask to be solved. They ask only to be shared. And across the world, in corners lit by soft lamps, by candlelight, by the glow of screens held gently in tired hands, people were finally beginning to share. In that way, Catherine lived not in the past, not in legend, but in the quiet, human spaces where memory meets mercy. It started with hesitation, as all honest things do, a blinking cursor on a blank screen, a pen hovering above a page, a silence that stretched longer than it should have. The woman didn't know exactly what she was trying to say. She had opened her notebook with the vague intention of writing an article about forgotten queens. A soft piece for a quiet journal. Nothing ambitious. Just a gentle exploration of the women's history didn't love enough to remember. But as soon as she wrote the first sentence, Catherine de' Medici ruled with grace and calculation. She felt something resist. The words rang hollow, staged, distant, as if she were writing about someone else entirely. She crossed the sentence out, tried again. Catherine de' Medici has long been misunderstood. No, still wrong, still wearing a costume. She stared at the page. The window beside her rattled softly in the wind. Her tea had gone cold. And slowly, without quite deciding to, she began to write something else, something she hadn't planned. "Dear Catherine," she wrote, the words slow, uncertain, but clear. "I don't know how to begin, except to say that I think I've carried your story longer than I realized." She paused, watched the ink dry, something stirred behind her. "Ribs," she continued. "I don't know everything you did. I don't know all the politics, the alliances, the betrayals. I know the official version, but I don't trust it anymore. I think there's more, not just facts, but feelings. And I think I've lived inside one of them for a very long time." She surprised herself with the next line. "I think I did what you did." The admission sat heavy on the page. Not because it was shameful, but because it was true. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain what she meant, didn't name the person or the moment or the choice that had changed everything. But Catherine would know. That was the strange comfort. Not that Catherine had the answers, but that she had the ache. The shared ache of choosing something that no one else understood, and then living with the silence that followed. The woman kept writing. Not for publication, not for scholarship, but for something far more urgent release, she told Catherine. About the nights she lay awake, wondering what might have happened if she'd spoken up. She told her about the letter she never sent, the hand she didn't take, the life she almost had. And somewhere along the line, the letter stopped being about Catherine. It became a mirror, a confession, a hand reaching across time not to rewrite history, but to finally touch it. She wrote for hours. The sun sank. The room darkened. Still, she wrote. And when she finally stopped, when her hand ached and her heart felt raw and relieved all at once, she folded the letter and pressed it between the pages of a book she hadn't opened in years. A history of women who shaped the world in ways the world refused to see. She didn't sign her name. She didn't reread the letter. But she placed a candle beside the book that night. And for the first time in years, she slept without dreaming of the door she never walked through. Somewhere, she believed, Catherine understood not the details, but the shape of it all. And that was enough. Because sometimes, healing isn't about understanding the past. It's about finally letting the past understand you. She hadn't planned to return, not consciously. Anyway, but one quiet afternoon when the sky threatened rain and her errands felt unnecessary. Her feet led her back to the museum, almost without asking. The kind of detour that feels accidental but isn't. She moved through the corridors like someone retracing a forgotten path in a half-remembered dream. The floors still creaked in familiar places. The same low hum of hush hung in the air like invisible thread. And then, at the end of the long hallway, she saw her again. The painting, the posture, the woman who had waited in silence all this time. But something was different now. Catherine had not changed. Her expression was still unreadable, her gaze still fixed just beyond the viewer, her hands still poised in that eternal not quite trust. And yet, the woman saw her differently. It wasn't reverence or curiosity anymore. It wasn't history either. It was recognition. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood quietly before the painting, letting the silence stretch long and gentle. The tray beneath the frame was still there, still filled with offerings. Folded paper, petals, faded photographs, buttons, lockets, letters with no return address. She reached into her bag, pulled out the letter, the one she'd written weeks ago, and tucked into the history book like a secret prayer. She didn't unfold it, didn't reread it. She simply placed it softly in the tray and let it go. The act wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like opening a window in a room long sealed, as if something could finally breathe again. She sat on the bench and looked at Catherine, not the queen, not the subject, not the tragic figure from footnotes and fiction, but the woman. The one who had made an impossible choice and then carried it alone for the rest of her life. The one who never answered her critics, who never rewrote the story, who simply lived with the ache. And for the first time, the woman didn't wonder what Catherine had done or why. She simply accepted that she had done it, and that she had. paid for it in ways too quiet for history to record. They sat there together, separated by centuries, but bound by something more durable than time. Shared silence. The kind that hums in the body. The kind that is passed down like lullabies that never quite leave the tongue. She thought about how many people had sat here before her. How many had whispered their confessions into the hush? How many had left pieces of themselves beneath the frame? Catherine had become not an artifact, but a vessel, a keeper of all the things people didn't know where else to put. The woman didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her grief had shifted. It was no longer sharp or loud. It had softened into something round, something she could hold without fear. After a long while, she stood, smoothed her coat, and leaned in close, just once, to whisper something no one else could hear. You weren't alone. Then she turned and walked away. Not heavy, not hollow, but lighter. As if something that had long followed her was now walking beside her instead. As if the past had reached forward, touched her shoulder gently, and said, I see you too. Somewhere, beyond the brushstrokes and oil and canvas, beyond the centuries of silence and speculation, something inside the painting softened, not changed, but received. Because sometimes the most radical act is not rewriting the past, but choosing to be at peace with it. By now, her name had all but disappeared from the stories people told, and yet Catherine had never been more present. She existed not in the facts, not in the lineage, not even in the tangled politics of the time from which she came, but in something. Gentler, a glance, a gesture, a knowing without explanation. In small kitchens where women stirred tea and paused too long before speaking. In old bookstores where readers found themselves weeping halfway through a novel, not because of what was written, but because of what it reminded them of. In train. Stations where two people crossed paths and felt, for the briefest moment, that they had once loved each other in another lifetime and simply never spoken of it. Catherine had become part of the landscape of human feeling, not as a figure. Of history, but as a scene running through the unspoken places in our lives. Her face, even for those who'd never seen the portrait, had become strangely familiar. Artists drew her without knowing they had. Writers shaped her into characters whose stories ended not with death, but with decision. A decision to walk away, to remain silent, to love without expectation. A decision to choose duty over desire, and then carry the cost with quiet dignity. She lived now in lullabies, hummed without words, in poems with no titles, in the long pauses people take when remembering something they swore they had buried. A child visiting the museum with no understanding of who she was or what she had done. Once stood before the painting and said, she's sad because she did something brave. And just like that, the entire legacy shifted. Not tragic, not monstrous. Not forgotten, brave and tired. And still loved. A young man kept her printed portrait folded in his wallet. It's not because he believed in her story exactly, but because he had loved someone once who never wrote back, and he had needed a place to put that silence. A woman kept a candle lit in. Her window on the anniversary of the day she almost said something, a soft ritual she never explained to anyone. And in a quiet care home, where memories grew thin and days repeated themselves, an elderly resident named Catherine, who had never claimed to be a queen, asked her nurse to place a ring in her drawer with no explanation. For what I never said, she whispered, and the nurse didn't ask. She just held her hand and sat beside her until the silence turned warm. These were not tributes. They were not ceremonies. They were the quiet ways people made room for the parts of themselves that history and family and survival had forced them to leave behind. Catherine had become a saint of the unsaid. Not worshipped, not exalted, but visited in those hidden. Moments of pause when a person realized they had loved deeply and had never been allowed to show it. And in that way, she became everyone. Not royalty, not villain, not martyr, just human. Soft, flawed, powerful in her restraint. Remembered, not for what she did, but for what she dared not say. Her legacy was not written in ink, but in pause, in hush, in breath held just before the truth. In the shared understanding between strangers who pass and think, I know that ache. I've lived that silence. She didn't need a name anymore. She had become a language of feeling. A myth shaped not by legend, but by the space she left behind. A space people needed. A space people filled with all they had never dared to speak. And that, in the end, was more eternal than any throne. The museum had not intended to move the painting. It had hung for years in the same modest gallery, unlisted in most brochures, not part of any grand tour, yet always quietly visited. But things change, as they always do, and renovations were announced. New lighting, new layout, a reshuffling of the permanent collection to make space for larger, louder exhibits. No one protested. It wasn't that kind of painting. It had never demanded attention. It had simply been there, waiting, listening, and now it would be moved. The announcement was small, tucked into the corner of a bulletin board. Gallery 4 will close for refurbishment. Select works will be relocated. No one needed to ask which painting that meant. The regulars came in quietly over the final days. Some brought fresh letters, some brought nothing at all. One woman brought a white glove and gently brushed dust from the tray below the frame. The staff noticed, but said nothing. They had long since stopped interfering. A child left behind a drawing, not of the painting, but of a girl with a candle and a ring, standing by a window that looked like it belonged to no century at all. On the final day, as the gallery lights dimmed, two curators approached the portrait with a kind of reverence usually reserved for relics or tombs. It's not because they believed in myth, but because they had seen what this painting had become. One of them whispered, "She's heavier than she looks," and the other nodded, not meaning the frame. They lifted her from the wall as if lifting a sleeping child, careful not to jostle the canvas, careful not to let the tray of offerings slip. There had been talk of storing her away, of letting her rest for a while. But something about that felt wrong. She was resting already. What she needed was not storage, but placement. Somewhere she could continue to do what she had always done, hold space, not be seen, but be felt. A decision was made, quietly, without press release. She was moved to a smaller room, deeper in the museum's old wing, a space used mostly for reflection, a low-ceilinged chamber with soft walls, dim light, and only a handful of chairs. No plaques, no timeline, just presence. There, on a wall barely taller than she was, the painting was hung again. Not to impress, not to educate, simply to be. The tray was kept. The candle was relit. A single phrase engraved on the wall beside. Her read, for all that was carried and never spoken. And so she remained again. But now, her silence was not solitude. It was sanctuary. Visitors came, slowly at first. Some found the room by accident, others by instinct. They stepped in, sat down, and stayed longer than they expected. Some left things behind: letters, feathers, bookmarks, scraps of poems, jewelry with no clasp. One man left an apology written on a napkin. Another left a small stone wrapped in silk. The museum staff never cataloged these items. They simply made space for them, because the portrait no longer belonged to history. It belonged to the quiet, to the ache, to the long pause after a goodbye that never sounded final. In time, no one spoke of her as Catherine anymore. She had become something else, a place, a presence, a still point in a moving world. And though her story remained half lost, half imagined, it was told every day in the way people approached her, in the hush they carried, in the weight they left behind, because some lives are not written in chapters. They are written in echoes. And this silent, steady image of a queen who once chose silence over scandal, restraint over ruin, was now an echo large enough for everyone to rest inside. She was not gone. She was not forgotten. She was here, and always had been. It was never clear when the legend began or who first told it differently. But somewhere along the way, Catherine ceased to be Catherine. Her name, her title, her court, even her portrait, they all blurred softly, like candle smoke rising in a room filled with hush. The details were still there for those who needed them. The letters, the alliances, the man whose life was ended with the stroke of her pen. But to most, her story had become something else entirely, something not taught, but passed along. She became the queen who waited, or the one who let him go, or the lady in the candle room, depending on who was telling the tale. In some versions, she was a widow who never remarried. In others, she was a sorceress who could not save the one she loved. Sometimes she was the villain, other times the saint. But always, always, she was the one who chose silence. And then bore its weight like a crown no one could steal. Children whispered her name in sleepover stories, unsure of its origin but drawn to the sadness in her eyes. Lovers spoke of her when parting, not as a warning, but as a shared ache. Don't. Let us become them. Writers borrowed her posture for characters who could not speak the truth and lived in the shadow of their decisions. Her face, or a face like hers, began to appear in unexpected places, on the cover of an old record titled Songs for the Top. Unfinished, in the background of a short film that made everyone cry without knowing why. In the final image of a graphic novel where a woman stands before a sealed door with a letter in her hand and never knocks. No one named her, but everyone knew her. She was what we imagined when we thought of the love we didn't fight for, the dream we folded away, the sentence we never finished. She was not history anymore. She was poetry. A myth stitched together by those who needed to believe that someone else somewhere had once felt what they now carried in silence. It didn't matter if the details were wrong. The truth of her was always in the feeling, the pause, the breath. The silence after a choice has been made, and the heart still lingers behind. A folk musician wrote a song titled The Ring She Left Behind. It told the story of a queen who placed a letter in the fire and watched it burn without tears. A dancer choreographed a solo performance called Stillness. After, where the final movement was simply the performer sitting in silence, facing the audience, unmoving until the lights faded. And in late autumn, when the air turned thin and the days shortened like held breath, some people lit a single candle at their windows. No words, no meaning spoken, just a flicker for the thing they never said, and the one who had once not said it either. These were not reenactments. They were not homages. They were echoes. Catherine had become something rare and strange, a royal figure whose power grew not through conquest or conquest's memory, but through surrender, through restraint, through the haunting, unbearable clarity of having almost lived a different life. In the end, her story belonged to everyone who had ever chosen duty over desire, who had ever stayed when they longed to run, who had ever placed love in a locked drawer and turned the key for reasons they could never fully explain. She became the story we told when we didn't know how to speak about regret, not to relive it, but to feel less alone inside it. And because of that, she became immortal in the only way that truly matters, not by being remembered, but by being felt, somewhere far from museums and myths. In a town where her name was never spoken aloud, a woman stood at the edge of something she could not name. Not a cliff, not a choice, but a feeling, the kind that arrives after months of stillness, when something in the body knows it must change before the mind does. She had been holding something, a grief, a memory, a possibility for so. long that it had become part of her. Not a burden, exactly. More like an extra heartbeat. Always there, always just beneath. And on this particular evening, with the sky pulling low and soft over the hills and the street lamps blinking on one by one like tiny hushes of light, she found herself walking without direction, guided only by the echo of something she hadn't yet named. Her hands were in her coat pockets, her thoughts elsewhere. But her heart was listening. And though she didn't know it, though she had never seen the portrait or read the letters or heard the stories whispered across candlelit tables, Catherine was with her, not as a ghost, not as a queen, but as a presence, a steady, a knowing. And so when she came upon the bench at the edge of the park, the one no one ever seemed to sit on, the one with the slightly chipped armrest and the view of nothing in particular, she paused, sat, listened, and after a long breath, she took something from her pocket. A ring, not expensive, not flashy, just simple, honest, the kind that once meant forever and now meant once upon a time. She didn't look at it long. She didn't weep. She simply placed it beside her on the bench and whispered, "You can stay here now." That was all. That was everything. Because there are moments when we don't need answers, only release. Moments when the story doesn't end, but loosens. She sat for a while longer, watched a dog run by, watched the light shift, and when she rose, she didn't feel lighter. Exactly, just clearer, so the ache had finally been named not in language, but in permission. The permission to love something and still let it go. The permission to remember and also keep walking. She didn't know the name Catherine. She didn't know the painting or the song or the room full of folded letters. But she knew what it meant to carry something quietly. She knew what it meant to choose stillness over pleading, to choose silence over apology, to hold a goodbye inside her body like a language no one else spoke. And in that knowing, Catherine lived again, not as a figure on canvas, but as breath, as choice, as courage. The woman walked home slowly. She made tea. She opened a window. She sat at her kitchen table and began to write, not a letter, not a story. It was never clear when the legend began or who first told it differently. But somewhere along the way, Catherine ceased to be Catherine. Her name, her title, her court, even her portrait, they all blurred softly. Like candle smoke rising in a room filled with hush. The details were still there for those who needed them. The letters, the alliances, the man whose life was ended with the stroke of her pen. But to most, her story had become something else entirely, something not taught, but passed along. She became the queen who waited, or the one who let him go, or the lady in the candle room, depending on who was telling the tale. In some versions, she was a widow who never remarried. In others, she was a sorceress who could not save the one she loved. Sometimes she was the villain, other times the saint. But always, always, she was the one who chose silence. And then, bore its weight like a... Even stories that live in silence must eventually find somewhere to rest. And Catherine's, though never fully spoken, never fully known, had begun to settle gently, like twilight dust across the shoulders of those who had once carried. Her no final moment announced its arrival. No epilogue was written, but those who had been changed by her story or by the feeling of it found themselves slowly becoming something softer. Not because they were healed exactly, but because they had been heard. A woman who had once visited the portrait every Thursday afternoon stopped going. Not out of forgetfulness, but because she no longer needed the silence to speak for her. She had found her own voice, slow and trembling and true. She still lit candles. She still remembered. But now, her remembrance was laced with gentleness, not ache. A man who had carried a single sentence in his chest for 20 years, I should have told him, finally said it aloud. Not to the person it was meant for, but to himself, in the mirror, eyes steady, hands open. He didn't expect release, but he found something like relief. And a child, young enough that the world hadn't yet pressed silence into her bones, walked past a street musician playing a song she couldn't name, and whispered to her mother, "This music feels like when someone misses someone they love but doesn't say it." Her mother stopped, bent down, kissed her forehead. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." These quiet recognitions formed a soft web across the world, invisible, delicate, but real. Catherine's name wasn't on anyone's lips, but her presence had become part of how people moved through sorrow, how they held on to grief without letting it devour them, how they honored what could have been without letting it undo what still was. In a sleepy town in the north, an elderly couple hosted a gathering they called the Table of the Unsung once a year. A handful of people brought one object representing something they had never spoken about. They didn't share their stories. They simply placed the objects on a linen-draped table, sat in silence, and then lit a candle. One flame for each secret that no longer needed to hide. When asked why they did it, the hosts always gave the same answer: because there are some truths too gentle for words. And in that room, surrounded by tokens of unsent letters, untold loves, and unresolved griefs, Catherine breathed, not in memory, not in mourning, but in presence. Because some stories don't end, they simply learn how to stay. They soften, they echo. They fold into the hearts of strangers and bloom slowly like morning light through heavy curtains. Catherine had become such a story, not retold, not reimagined, simply remembered in the body, in the pauses between sentences, in the choices. People made to let love be known even when it hurt. Not loudly, not perfectly, but truly. She had taught them not how to speak, but how to listen. Not how to undo the past, but how to make space for it in the present. And that, more than any crown, more than any rule, was her quiet triumph. And so, the story dimmed, not vanished, not erased, but dimmed like the last light that slips through the shutters just before night takes hold. Catherine was no longer remembered in detail, but in atmosphere. She became the hush before someone says something they've never dared say. The cool hand on a shoulder in a room where grief has grown heavy. The warmth of a single candle flickering in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening. People no longer spoke of her name, and that felt right because her story had ceased to be about identity. It was now about recognition, about how we understand each other without needing to explain. A man in a cafe in Lisbon sat across from a woman he'd loved in silence for years. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his hand brushing hers for only a moment. She said nothing, but something passed between them, not an answer, but a softness. Later, when asked what had happened, he said only, "We remembered someone who had never been forgotten." In another part of the world, a granddaughter sat beside her dying grandmother, who in her final hour whispered, "I once chose silence, and it made a life." The girl didn't know the story, but she understood the shape of the sentence, and she carried it forward, not as sorrow, but as something sacred. In the mountains, where wind hummed through pine and snow rested heavy on rooftops, a stranger left a small locket inside a chapel with no priest, no note, no ribbon. Just the object, placed gently on an old stone ledge with a single word scratched. Beneath it, still, there were no prayers, no songs, no names. And yet Catherine was there, in the stillness, in the offering, in the decision to part with something once so close to the heart. Her presence became the kind that needed no reminder, because it was already woven into how people breathe through their regrets. Not every person knew her story, but many lived pieces of it. The quiet goodbye, the heavy letter never sent, the feeling of having chosen what was right and forever wondering what it cost. And somehow, knowing Catherine had done it too. Centuries ago, in a world both foreign and familiar, made it bearable. Not easier, but bearable. Her legacy was not written in the boldness of actions, but in the grace of restraint. She had become the dusk of memory, not the dark, but the turning. That soft edge between what was and what is, between what might have been and what still matters. She had shown people that silence can be holy. That love, even when hidden, can leave light behind. And now, she didn't walk with anyone. She didn't haunt. She didn't echo in halls or rise in visions. She simply became the background hue of healing, the quiet blue of memory, the deep purple of reflection. The golden thread running through the stories people whispered to themselves when no one else could listen. Catherine was no longer history. She was no longer myth. She was simply part of what it means to have loved deeply and let go gently. And in that space, that slow, exhaled moment between heartbreak and peace, she rested. Not gone, just quietly present, like dusk. Like breath, like the soft place where endings become something else entirely. Some stories never ask to be told. They simply wait to be felt. And Catherine's, though shaped by history, had long since left the confines of fact and stepped quietly into the hands of strangers who needed her without knowing why. She had become the name people didn't remember, but the feeling they couldn't forget. A presence carried in silence, passed down not in books, but in gestures. A woman who, at 37, stood alone in a train station with a suitcase full of everything she didn't say to someone years ago, paused before boarding, closed her eyes, and whispered, it mattered. She never said what. She never had to. A teenager, unsure of who she was, but certain she was losing something she couldn't name, wrote a single line in the corner of her journal. She let him go, and the world kept turning, but slower. In a city full of noise, an elderly man walked into a bookstore and asked for a book that didn't exist. When the clerk said, "There's no record of that," he smiled and replied, "Some stories aren't written. They're remembered," and walked away. These moments, small, strange, beautiful, became Catherine's true record. Not dates, not decrees, but echoes in ordinary lives. She was no longer the Queen of France. She was no longer the mother who buried sons, the widow who ruled through blood and smoke. She had shed her titles long ago. What remained was something far older and far truer, the quiet courage of restraint. The weight of choosing silence when the world demands sound, and the soft grief of having loved too deeply to fight against fate. People carried her in the way they carried songs they'd only ever heard once, in the way they stared at the sea, thinking of someone they could never quite name, in the way they held the phone but didn't call or reread a message from years ago and smiled before deleting it. She was not their story, but she reminded them of it. She had become the soul of unfinished things. And perhaps that was why no statue had ever been raised in her name. Why no grand opera was composed, no sweeping film adorned in her honor. Because Catherine's power wasn't in being remembered. It was in helping others remember themselves. In the forgotten letters people found in drawers. In the books they couldn't throw away. In the scent that brought back a day they hadn't thought about in years. She was the heartbeat in the background. The hush after someone says, "I'm fine," and someone else doesn't believe them. The moment before the door closes, and the long breath taken after it does. And in that breath, Catherine lived. Not as history, not as fiction, but as a presence. A hush that wrapped itself around people who had once believed they were alone in their silence. They weren't. She was there. She always had been. Not to change the ending, but to keep them company through it. And perhaps that is how all the most enduring legacies are kept. Not in the grandeur of marble, nor in the fire of revolution, but in the soft transference of understanding between those who have never met. Catherine had long since slipped free of the stories that once confined her. She was no longer a queen who made impossible decisions. She was no longer the figure in the oil painting hung in a museum gallery. She had become something else entirely, an inheritance of softness, passed not through lineage, but through experience. She belonged now to the ones who stayed quiet in the moment they could have screamed, to the ones who chose not to chase what might have saved them, to those who closed the letter halfway through writing it, not because the words didn't matter, but because they mattered too much. She belonged to the lovers who met at the wrong time, to the mothers who sacrificed dreams they never spoke of, to the sons who walked away before understanding their fathers, to the daughters who waited too long for someone to return and then built new lives anyway. Catherine became the silence that people began to respect instead of fear. The space between memories where truth could rest. And in that way, she was no longer alone, across time, across countries, across languages and faces and generations. People carried her without ever having seen her portrait. A woman in a cafe in Oslo ran her fingers slowly along the rim of her teacup, staring at nothing in particular, and felt suddenly understood, not by anyone in the room, but by something much older. A man in Tokyo passed by a mirror and caught a flicker of something in his own expression, something unsaid. Something endured, and instead of turning away, he nodded as if to someone standing just behind him. A girl in Buenos Aires pressed a note into the binding of a library book she would never check out again. It read, "I forgive myself for not speaking. I know now that silence is a kind of love too." And she left it there, certain someone would find it who needed it more. These were the children of Catherine, not by blood, but by breath. Not by name, but by ache. They did not owe her. They did not even know her, but they felt her. And in doing so, they softened. They forgave. They let go. And they began to live differently, not louder, but deeper. Because once a story has shown you that your pain is not unshared, that your silence is not strange, it becomes a companion. It becomes a bridge. Catherine was never the end. She was always the threshold. And those who stepped through her memory did not become shadows. They became carriers of gentleness in a world so often ruled by noise. They paused more, held others longer, wrote the letter and left it open, stood beside grief without rushing. It loved without asking to be owed anything in return. And so her legacy continued, not in the royal halls of France, not in the pages of dusty archives, but in 1,000 unnamed lives where love and sorrow exist together. Unspoken, but understood, Catherine gave them no answers. She only made it possible to ask better questions, and that was enough. That was everything. So much had been said without being spoken. So much had been carried without a sound. And now, at the end of the story, or whatever this quiet shape of remembrance had become, there was no need for a grand conclusion. Catherine's presence lingered not as a figure to be understood, but as a feeling to be held. She had slipped through centuries like smoke through keyholes, finding her way into the lives of those who never learned her name but lived her echo. There was no plaque to mark her legacy, no single line to define what she had meant, but in the low murmur of evening, when people sat with themselves in the hour between distraction and sleep, she was there. In the way someone stared at their phone and didn't send the message. In the way someone set the table for one less and still placed the extra fork out of habit. In the way someone walked past a shop window and caught their reflection and felt, for a flicker of a second, the full weight of something they hadn't said years ago. Catherine's story was never about history. It was about humanity, about how deeply we can love and how quietly we can break. About how silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's the most profound kind of presence. She had not died. In the pages of the past, she had simply unfolded there, slowly, like a letter no one expected to open but found themselves unable to put down. And those who found her not through research, but through resonance, did not seek to define her. They sat with her. They allowed her story to mirror their own. And in doing so, they allowed themselves the grace to be unfinished, to be soft, to be real. A woman in her 70s, sorting through a lifetime of letters in a cedarwood box, found one she never remembered writing. It was addressed to someone she had loved once, or thought she had. She didn't open it. She simply held it in her lap, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me feel this again." Across the world, a man stood at a podium to give a eulogy and paused, heart caught in his throat, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he suddenly realized the person he'd lost had once carried their own silence too. And in that pause, something was passed down, not regret, but reverence. Catherine had become part of these moments, not as ghost, not as martyr, as witness, a witness to the way people survive things they don't speak about, a witness to the private decisions we make that change the course of everything. And so, she was never forgotten. Because to forget her would mean forgetting every soft goodbye, every turned-back glance, every letter never mailed, every love left unclaimed for reasons no one else would ever understand. And that is something we all carry. In the deepest part of our memory, in the softest part of our chest. She does not ask to be remembered. She only asks not to be erased. And in that simple request, in that hush, she remains. And so, at last, the story fades, not into darkness, but into quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that arrives after the final page has been turned and the reader sits still, not ready to close the book just yet. Catherine's tale had never been about finality. It was about endurance, about the slow bloom of feeling in places history never thought to look. She had been many things: queen, strategist, mother, widow, whisperer of decisions too heavy for daylight. But in the end, she became something simpler, something softer. She became a hush that asked nothing and offered everything. Her story ended not with triumph or ruin, but with an understanding that to have loved and lost, and to have kept going anyway, is perhaps the most human act of all. Those who found her did not grieve her, not really. They carried her, walked with her, and then, when it was time, they let her rest. In quiet corners of memory, in unsent letters tucked into drawers, in poems never published and melodies never sung outside the privacy of kitchens and bedrooms and empty stairwells. She became part of how people survived what they never spoke. Aloud, a man once said to his daughter, "There was a queen who loved so fiercely she had to hide it." The girl asked, "Did anyone ever find her love?" And the man, who had lived a lifetime of silent heartbreak, smiled gently and replied, "Yes, we did." In that moment, Catherine was alive again, not as a crown, not as a scandal, but as a truth. And it was enough, because sometimes stories are not written to teach or warn or even inspire. Sometimes they are simply here to keep us company, to remind us that we are not alone in our silence, that what we've carried, our hidden griefs, our noble sacrifices, our private regrets, are not just burdens. They are bridges. And across those bridges, we find one another, not in loud reunions, but in soft recognitions, a glance, a pause, a breath. Catherine's breath, still lingering, even now. And yet, it's different, isn't it? The weight has shifted. What once felt like sorrow now feels like reverence, like a love that chose to stay behind so others could move forward. She is no longer waiting. She is no longer bound. She has been seen. And because of that, she can finally rest in a museum room still dimly lit. Beneath a tray of paper hearts and dried petals, her portrait hangs. But if you look too long, you might swear it's not a painting at all. You might feel it watching back. You might feel in your bones that she knows you, that she forgives you. that she forgave herself. And when you leave the room, you will. Do so quieter than when you entered, not because of grief, but because of grace. Catherine is not a lesson. She is a lullaby, a final breath held not in fear, but in peace. And now, she sleeps.